Welcome to another Lone Star RP3 live event. I'm Kate Greer, and with me today is Peter Beard, Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. We're going to spend the next just shy of an hour today talking about Texas's workforce. As always, I've got a set of questions prepared to get the conversation going, but please feel free to add your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can later in today's conversation. So Peter, let's begin by learning a little bit more about you today. You've been at the tip of the spear for workforce development for many years now. Tell us a little bit about your relatively new role at the U.S. Chamber.
So at the Chamber Foundation, part of the role, I serve on the workforce team, and our workforce team really focuses in on kind of 3 or 4 major issues. One is, how do we have employer-led talent development? So we have a methodology that helps communities and chambers and other organizations begin to develop the talent pipeline by framing it as almost as a supply chain problem, where the employer and the collaborative employers share the skills, the demand for workers, as well as where they source their best talent, all to the education and community-based organizations in order to help develop that pipeline. We also think about how do we improve the data, like the skills data, so it's communicated effectively, but the demand data and other things. We can go into a lot of detail about what we can be doing in that space, and Texas is leading in that space. Another area of work that we focus in on is really around how do we think about financing that talent. In particular, the work we're looking at is how do we upskill and reskill a big part of our workforce, just given how quickly skills are changing. And we also need to be thinking about how we're ensuring folks can access education to enter the workforce for the first time.
So it's a pipeline issue. We know in Texas why economic development and workforce supply is important, but you've been at the Chamber since January. In your view, why is this a necessary topic for us to be discussing today?
So I think if we think about why it's important, there are 2 parts to workforce and growth in our economy. One is people. And if you think about where Texas is, it's in a very favorable space in terms of the folks that are coming to Texas and the size of the population. But if you look at the United States generally, we're having a constrained kind of population. We're beginning to hit kind of the baby boom generation beginning to retire, and then kind of a decreasing population. But the other part to growing an economy is around productivity, which is a function of skills and technology. And so if we're really thinking about why this is important, is we need to have 100% of Texans working in our workforce with the best skills, using the best technology possible to continue kind of the miracle of Texas.
That's great. And prior to your time at the U.S. Chamber, you helped lead some of those efforts during your time at the Houston Partnership, when you led the Upskill Houston initiative that really became a national model for public-private partnerships and workforce development. Why was this important to Houston, and what were some of the successes that you saw as a result of the project?
I mean, I think there were a number of successes, but the reason it was important was in 2014, as fracking and shale gas came along, it changed the cost structure of the petrochemical industry, which then required how are we building the workforce to meet the needs of this greater demand. So it was both the petrochemical construction or petrochemical industry, but the industrial construction workforce, which is 5x kind of what's needed in the facility, and an important part of that. And we can come back to the important role that the skilled trades like electricians, HVAC, and plumbers or pipe fitters play in today's economy, not just with the petrochem, but with data centers and other things. And those skilled trades, those skilled professions are going to be really, really important. So we had a number of successes building the petrochemical, helping the industry work with education to build the pipeline of petrochemical workers and professionals along with the industrial construction. We also spent time in healthcare. We also spent time in transportation and logistics. And we also were looking at an emerging industry like hydrogen, and how do we build the hydrogen workforce as a hydrogen hub was going to be coming to Houston. So there were a number of different pieces to that.
What you teased out was a real economic need and an employer need of skilled talent. I know that sometimes education institutions, or often, can want to facilitate employer partnerships, but it can feel like a lot, right? How do you get work-based learning? How do you structure apprenticeships or internships in a way to propel your workforce pipeline? I wonder if you could share some of the best practices you are seeing to facilitate those partnerships and some that might be worth scaling.
I mean, I think part of it is, employers need to have their voice, and we need to give room for that voice. And so education institutions are critical partners, but employers are just as critical because they have the three pieces of information that folks want. How many of what do you need? What capabilities and skills do you need in them? And where are you sourcing your best talent? And how do you grow that talent? So, if you think about the petrochemical industry, there needs to be technical training that's important before you even enter the plant. But you also need to understand how you run the plant before you even walk into the plant. So a lot of the community college programs are building a lot of those skills and education that's necessary to get into a hospital or a healthcare facility or a petrochemical or a manufacturing facility. And at the same time, if you look at construction and some others, there's a progression. It looks much more like an apprenticeship, but you need to know the skills so that you can kind of begin to work that way. And so part of it is, creating an environment. And, over the 10 years I was in Houston, we had built this collaborative table that had employers. It had the chancellors and presidents of the community colleges, the superintendents of the school districts, and community-based organizations along with the public workforce system all at the table. And every time we went back to kind of refresh the strategy, the most important thing we had built was that collaborative table that allowed for communication to occur, allowed people to have random connections, and it really got people to connect in a very different way and understand what are the motivations, interests, and incentives, which are really, really important to understand if you're trying to build that workforce.
So it's not just about what project are you assigning the student or what is their exposure, but also how are the leaders in all the sectors coming together and aligning on really shared vision and strategies along the way to meet the needs.
And creating shared value, because the other piece, as much as it is important for employers to have, a skilled workforce, as leaders within the Houston community, we also wanted to ensure there was economic mobility and opportunity for all the residents of Houston, which is the same in Texas, which is we need to be creating greater economic mobility and opportunity.
I love that you mentioned that because Texas is projected to add roughly 1 million or more than 1 million new jobs coming up, many of which require something beyond a high school diploma, but not quite a 4-year degree, something in between. And I think a lot about real-time data to inform pathways into good careers, both from a compliance perspective, but we're moving away from just compliance to strategic planning, shaping decisions. So what role does real-time data play in helping shape policy decisions, but also employer decisions, particularly when we're in this moment that we're in right now in 2025, when the pace of change is unmatched?
So it's a complicated question, which is it's a good question because I think a focus of the real-time data historically has been how many. And that's really important at some level. But given what you just said, there are 1 million new jobs, it's a growing state. We're going to have a lot of demand. So I think, you can pay attention to that. But the more important part of the real-time data would be what are the skills and what are the skills that are emerging in kind of the roles that we need to be thinking about building for, which now is becoming much more technologically driven than it's ever been, which, there's a recent article in the Harvard Business Review that says, should the CHRO role be merged with the CTO role, which really gets to the fact that technology, artificial intelligence, everyone's going to be working alongside of that. And so what are the skills that are emerging, and then what are the collisions from different domains that are emerging as well that we should be thinking about? How do we prepare for that as well?
Yeah, and you and I have talked before about kind of the 3 different buckets of employees, so types of workers, so frontier workers. Do you want to share a little bit about your perspective on that?
Yeah, so as you think about it, Texas is huge with a lot of opportunity where they're thinking about what are some of the frontier opportunities we need to be thinking about. You can say, everything we're doing with space and aerospace is part of that frontier because that's changing so much. Quantum computing, the data centers, all of those are on the frontier and may not already be here yet, but they're coming. And how do we plan for that? How do we invest in our educational institutions to have the ability to build that? And then there are going to be retooled roles just because of what we just talked about. Technology is getting embedded in, and then folks are going to have to use technology in a very different way. We're still going to need electricians, HVAC, plumbing, and a whole host of things, but the technology that's going to be embedded with it is going to be critical to do that. And then there are going to be a lot of legacy ones. Our education roles, our, even our healthcare roles will have a lot of technology built into them, but they become critically important for that.
I think it's really smart to think about not every job will go through the same change. We will all evolve, right? And the need to, you've talked about curiosity as a core value that employers look for. But it's helpful for educational institutions, research institutions to think about thematic roles that some job staffing might need to staff up for versus ones that we know the demand will continue. We know we still need highly trained teachers in Texas classrooms because when we have highly trained teachers, we can be more effective at preparing the next generation of students. I want to get really down into a practical level.
Okay.
As a former Texan, you are very aware that Texas has made huge strides with legislative policy in recent years to get us more toward workforce-ready Texans when they graduate high school or community college. This comes to fruition in both the college career military outcomes bonus funds that high schools are rewarded, and also our community college finance formula, which was overhauled just a few years ago to really reward community colleges financially based on student completion to a credential of value. All of that relies on timely data. So I wonder, what is your perspective as someone who looks at a lot of employer data, someone who really studies these workforce partnerships? Is Texas where we need to be right now in having good, timely data for these opportunities?
It's getting there. I mean, it's in the very top tier of kind of longitudinal data systems, which are critically important for doing that. But we still need to get more granular, both from what the employers are sharing, but also how do we have more real-time data related to the skills. And one of the efforts we've got going on at the Chamber Foundation is something called JobSide, which is job skills for in-demand employment. And the idea is to help employers take their position descriptions, input it, be able to draw from artificial intelligence and other things that are built into it, and create a skills profile for the role that they're getting at. So you get to the skills almost in real time. And the other use of it is for education and community-based organizations to align their learning objectives to the skills in demand. And so I think, once again, Texas is far ahead of most states in this space, but there's huge opportunity for improving it, particularly as it relates to the skills piece of this. And then I would take it a step further. The credential of value is really, really important. But what we see in the research and even in the data, it's kind of having some work experience, and whether it's an apprenticeship, internship, or some sort of work-based learning in the classroom becomes an important part of having a credential of value that actually has labor market value to it.
I imagine you can vet some of those skills you need or do some of that side-by-side coaching in an employer setting that may be more challenging or require more creativity on educational institutions to do that in a traditional classroom.
I mean, you and I were talking about kind of what I describe as the 5 C's, which are, this is what employers are generally looking for. People who can communicate, people who can collaborate, people who can provide critical thinking, people who are creative, and people who are curious. Those 5 capabilities are the foundation for what people are going to need to be successful in the future. Because work is changing so quickly, if you're not curious enough, someone else is going to take your job. And so how are we ensuring people leave, whether it's K through 12 or post-secondary, with those 5 capabilities? And it really has to do with how we create that environment in the classroom or partner with an employer to provide those kinds of opportunities.
Yeah, I think about it as not being a zero-sum game of, are you teaching curiosity or are you teaching phonics, right? But how do you use your instruction in phonics to encourage curiosity, right? It's I think those skills, what you were saying, is it's so often how those skills are developed in a classroom, less like do they take a test at the
Yep.
end of the semester and say, yes, you are creative and collaborative, but those often come through the classroom environment more naturally
Yeah.
with a skilled teacher.
And when I was talking to Accenture, the number one skill they hire for is learning and curiosity.
Yeah. That has to relate to the pace of change
Yeah.
right now.
And if you think about it, if you're a consultant and you're working in this environment where everything's changing quickly, if you don't know how to research and deliver something, it's going to be really, really hard.
Yeah. You're in a unique position now where you can help the LONESTARP3 community zoom out of our Texas ecosystem, which we are so proud of. And like you've said, we've done a really good job as a state at propelling us to be where we need to be. But what are some other states that are promising examples, or states that we might want to learn from when it comes to aligning workforce supply and demand?
Oh, there are many different ones, and let's break them down a little bit. There are states that are doing really good work to help individuals have agency over the education and skills they possess, so you can create a different kind of marketplace. So
Say more about that. What does that look like?
So you and I both graduated, I'm sure, from a four-year institution, and our, college record is a piece of paper that's locked away somewhere. In order for me to get, that thing, I've got to put it in, and it doesn't say anything other than I probably took economics courses and philosophy courses. It doesn't tell anything about the skills, but how are we potentially taking what's in a syllabus, what's in your college record, and saying, here are some of the skills and capabilities that came out of it. So what are the opportunities there? And I think Arkansas and Alabama are doing some really good work in this whole space of how do we improve the education records. And then the other thing is, we're all employed, which means there are things there, whether it's the wage record or kind of who we work for, that if we had a digital piece of that, we could share it in a different way. So what are the pieces focused on the user and the worker and the learner to have their kind of agency over their data and skills and other things? And then the other one really is, what are we doing to help position employers to ensure that they're in a space to kind of know what's changing and be able to work together on that?
We have a question from the audience wondering, how can our education system and accountability systems evolve to meet the 5 C's that you're talking about?
I think that part of this is engaging with employers in a very different way. We were talking about, and I think about work-based learning as a continuum. The deep end of the pool is apprenticeship and internships because it requires employers to partner in a very different, more intensive way. And those are critically important things and actually help students and learners be ready for that workforce. But how do we then potentially bring employers into the classroom to help develop those skills? And so at the Chamber Foundation, we have something called Employer Provided Innovation Challenges, which is having an employer partner with an educational institution, whether it's K through 12 or post-secondary, to say, here's a real life issue that we're confronting, and over 5 weeks, could we have a team of students work on it and come up with a solution? And so those are things where an employer can actually come into the classroom and help provide that piece of it. And how do we scale that in a very different way? And you and I were talking about Junior Achievement's 3DE effort, which is a very similar piece. So how are we doing that so that there's greater dosage of folks getting exposed to that, so they, one, know the opportunities and other things? And I guess the final piece I would say is the Chamber, not the Chamber Foundation, has partnered with a college board to build out the first AP course in business with financial literacy. And really, when you think about how that course is taught, even though the employer is not present, it's about like create a business plan, create a team to kind of think how you would develop that business plan, then how do you do the pitch to an investor to do that? So you're building kind of the teamwork skills, the critical thinking skills, the communication skills, all in a very different way.
I'm very energized by this, and I think people watching are as well, because we have folks wondering, what are the implications on the 5 C's for like teacher preparation programs, things like that? And I want you to answer, but it's also not lost on me that one of those 5 C's, collaboration, could be the key to making some of this feel like not such a heavy lift,
Yep.
right, if we're sharing the load.
No, I think that's right. And I'm going to come back to the 3DE example because I think that's the perfect example of what's the collaboration look like. So in order for 3D to work, the school district partners with an employer who then partners with the English, math, social studies, and science teachers to teach similar. What's a problem over 5 weeks that students could be working on? And that shows one, teamwork, but then adjusting the curriculum to meet this, the accountability standards, but actually collaborating in a different way, in a meaningful way. And so I think that's a really good example.
Yeah, I think that's a really practical thing that folks can take away, right? How do we start to have these conversations and broaden our circle, not in a way to say, how can you partner with me on apprenticeships, but let's start to build this relationship similar to what you did at Upskill Houston too. I have to ask this question because we have a bunch of data nerds in our audience who are both enamored with our ERCs and also sometimes frustrated in the current gaps in data. So from your seat, where do you see gaps in how we currently collect and share workforce data? And how do those gaps impact decision making?
So I'm going to give you a near-term
Okay.
kind of answer to that, and then a longer term, we maybe need to think differently about it. The near-term one really focuses on the fact that we have a set of data systems that were built for the 20th century that started out as compliance that we're now leveraging for strategic planning, policy, and research purposes. So there's an opportunity to improve how we report, how employers report data to the Workforce Commission through the Unemployment Insurance Report. Now, if you're an employer that is in more than one state, there is no standard definition of the elements of that report. And what happens if we were able to kind of unify that to have more consistent data standards, but quality data standards that is communicating here's the occupation and here's the pay and here are the other things to strengthen that up. That and Texas is advancing in that space. If you think about what else is going on, an employer also has to report new hires to a different report. So there are probably 150 different kinds of potential reports that an employer is providing, whether it's for Social Security or other things. And so if you begin to think about the current environment today, that data, those data are all housed in various places. Imagine if we could kind of create a new utility where that data migrated immediately into the various places rather than kind of a static report that was created for one purpose, but we're trying to use for a different purpose. That same data was the same data you and I were talking about originates from each of us, whether it's our education performance or our work performance. How do we once again, empower individuals around that? And once again, most recently in August, the Chamber Foundation released kind of a thought-provoking area of like, how could we have a new data paradigm that's a public-private utility that is built for the 21st century?
I like that as a nirvana long
Yeah,
term. I also wonder, what are some practical recommendations that you would make to the viewers today from your seat as employer or employer adjacent? How can organizations like chambers or schools or workforce boards better align that data sharing? Is there a role that they can do locally or on a small scale basis so we're not waiting for some broad change at the state or federal level?
I'm going to come back to our jobs, the job side tool, because it is a tool. Yeah. But imagine if you were, and we're likely to see the potential of that job side tool being adopted at a more national level in various ways. But imagine if a local chamber was bringing that into the community to say, hey, we can actually help improve, one, what your job descriptions are all about, but we can actually communicate the skills more effectively to the community-based organizations and the educational institutions in a very different way. That would improve it leaps and bounds, and you'd have real-time data related to the skills. May not have the demand data, but if you know kind of what is important to an employer, you'll be able to see that in a different way. That's a practical kind of piece to that.
Do these same themes that we're talking about, you've referenced petrochemicals a lot, do these apply to rural communities, urban communities? Are rural communities facing unique challenges in this space?
Rural communities are probably facing unique challenges. One part of it's the population. And but also part of it is how do we understand what their economy is? Is it agricultural? Is it extraction? Is it, so what is the kind of the basis of the economy, and how are we ensuring we're building the workforce for that? And once again, kind of coming back to the, where there are a lot of roles that cut across multiple places, which would apply in the rural space. So the Walmart and Burning Glass Institute did a really interesting piece called Skills First. So they brought together 10 employers, Walmart, Blackstone, Nordstrom, Bank of America, Verizon, and some others, and they were like, could we agree on kind of common skills profiles that the 10 companies had? And they thought it would take forever to do it. They actually did it fairly quickly, and these 9 skill profiles, include financial analyst, product manager, warehouse manager, all these things that are common to all of those organizations, which are common to a lot of other organizations. So there's a lot of work going on where we could actually begin to bring those in and accelerate kind of making sure we had curriculum and awareness that these are opportunities.
So you could use economies of scale in an urban setting to provide relief or some additional support in more rural parts of the state.
And I think that's another benefit of House Bill 8, which is, Lone Star, Dallas, Austin, Houston, San Antonio, all have community colleges that, have more unique programs that may not be available in the rural areas, but because of kind of what's in House Bill 8, the ability to use those curriculum become pretty important.
Yeah. Texas is one of the most diverse states in the nation, but not everyone is participating equally in our labor force right now. What strategies have been most effective in bringing underrepresented groups into high demand or high wage fields?
Employers want a diverse, a workforce that's diverse. We can start with our construction. It's predominantly male. And any construction employer I've talked to values, females being in it, one, because it expands the number of potential workers, but they also have the same set of skills. And so there's a lot of opportunity for us to be thinking differently about it. And once again, it goes to this broader piece of it, which is a frame of we need 100% of our eligible workers working in our industries at the top of their skills capabilities and continue to grow those capabilities and be able to use technology. And so how are we going into some of those underserved areas and ensuring we're building pathways to those? And there are ways to think about, adults that are already in there that have skill adjacencies, and then figure out what's the upskilling that's needed to get them to the next job that does that.
Yeah, and what I so appreciate about your perspective in this is we've talked a lot about the macroeconomic impacts on state GDP and national GDP, but you also feel really strongly about the impact on local individual families, individuals, when they're able to upskill, reskill. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think it's really important. One, when you think about it, and we were having the conversation that, before, which is it all starts in the early childhood, and we need to continue to focus on investing in quality early childhood education, because that's the basis for kind of building that future workforce. But it also requires a stable family environment. And so how are we doing that if we're not also creating economic opportunity for families to move out of this space? The statistics, we've heard in a lot of different ways. A huge chunk of the population doesn't have $400 in savings for an emergency. We know that a significant, almost 50% of the population are ALAs, asset limited, income constrained, and employed, and are just hovering in their ability to kind of survive. And so what we should be doing, and from an employer's perspective, it becomes important because they become more stable workers. They're not thinking about where's the next dollar coming from. But part of it's also making sure we invest in the skills development to do that.
Yeah. Going back to we had another audience question come through that teases this out a little bit. I think many of us who are primarily in the educational institution space, when we reach out to employers, it can feel like, oh, we're asking them to do us a favor, right? So but it seems like when you were in Houston, it wasn't a favor that employers were at the table. It was part of the crux of their business and their workforce pipeline. Is there a secret sauce you can share?
So here would be my secret sauce. and you can adapt this to this. I think about it as a win-win negotiation, which means I have to come in knowing what the pain point of the employer I'm going to get ready to talk to is. To say, hey, I can help address that in this way. And here's what I need to accomplish as well. And we'll be able to create a win for you, a win for me, and a win for the individual that we're helping to support. And so I think we usually go in wanting something like, I want paid internships for all my students, as opposed to, I know you need, capable workers that are ready to enter the workforce. One way to do that is an internship. I mean, and another way to kind of engage an employer would also be, I've got this really good program, could you come audit it? But I'd have 2 of my best students there.
Oh, interesting.
And then say, hey, these folks are really high quality, are there any internship opportunities? Which starts the relationship without it being like, okay, now we got to build something. So there are a lot of different ways to do it, but I would use it, one, get advice and counsel on how to improve the curriculum, but also use it as an opportunity to sell.
Yeah. Well, and what you kind of teased out in that first part is as real-time data continues to improve, then there's a real role of policy, research, practice, folks coming together and helping forecast out.
Yep.
So if a school district or community college may not have the resources or capacity to help forecast jobs, there's certainly other entities across the state that can help them do that and then make that competitive offer to the employers in their region.
And that also comes back to the importance of job site. That would create more robust data for the education research centers.
Absolutely. Just a reminder that we really appreciate the questions coming through today. It's a very active chat, so please keep them coming. We're really enjoying this. I have to ask, we started this conversation a few minutes ago, didn't quite finish it. Other states to watch right now?
I mean, I think there are a couple others where I would be able to watch. Going back to the longitudinal data, Virginia has something called the Virginia Office of Education Economics. And the whole idea of it is to get that kind of data from the longitudinal systems and then provide technical assistance to the community colleges and the 4-year institutions related to credentials of value. Like, how do you improve that? And so Virginia would be one on that piece of it. I think, Kentucky has done some very amazing things where, the state government leaned into the state chamber and conducted a talent pipeline management academy across the state, and they began to divide the state up into geographies, and then had equine horses, and then they added distilling for obvious reasons. But it really began to create a common methodology and approach that the state could use, and so it wasn't just chambers at the table, it was education, it was the workforce boards and others, so they were using a more common methodology that allows them to have a better conversation. Colorado's doing some very similar stuff, Illinois is doing some very similar stuff. And those are just some good examples of folks that are thinking about that.
I never thought we'd have a nod to the Kentucky Derby in our conversation today. I'm not
Well, don't
complaining.
forget bourbon.
That's bourbon, right? I want to talk about magic wands, right?
Okay.
You've been in this field for a while. You've seen a lot, and I know that you have things where you're like, if I could just fix this one pain point, or if I could make magic happen, we would be able to do this, which would smooth transitions. What is your magic wand? Let's start with just like workforce pipeline in general.
Okay. Now, I prompted you on this one, but if I could wave a magic wand, I would have anyone graduating from high school and anyone graduating from higher ed, whether it's community college or 4-year institution, be proficient in Excel.
Why?
Because when you think about it, it's not about the data and being able to add, subtract, and do the other things. It's the data analytics. So Excel is the basis for data analytics. And when you think about what's coming with artificial intelligence, with technology in the workplace, fixing the technology is going to require data analytics. When you think about a technician working on a car today, they're doing data analytics. They've got to be able to understand what's good data, what's bad data, how do we manipulate the data. And frankly, if you came out of high school or college with proficiency in Excel spreadsheet, your employers are going to love you because particularly if you can visualize it, if you can, in a very different way. It's just a very useful skill, but it really gets back to like the foundation going forward is really, can we do data analytics and critical thinking?
I imagine that's going to become even more important now as artificial intelligence is scaling and the ability to maybe help feed those models or check those models. How do you see AI, this is a question I'm surprised hasn't come through, but how do you see AI impacting workforce talent pipeline over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years?
So everyone's heard, and it's probably going to be true at least for the initial foreseeable future, if you don't have AI skills, AI is not going to be the one that replaces you. It'll be the person who does have AI skills to replace you. And so part of it is everyone's going to need to be fluent in kind of, literate about artificial intelligence, prompting, the ethics related to it is baseline going forward. Also,
Is that the role of an education institution right now? Is that self-guided learning? When you think about, what would you tell one of your mentees who's thinking about, I need this?
I think it's both.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one, going back to curiosity and kind of having a learning mindset, but I think education has the opportunity to help people understand the strengths and weaknesses of AI. I was at a college event recently, and they had the English teachers, professors, talking about how they were using AI in their classrooms in terms of they got students to write a paper, but then they put it in and asked AI to generate what's the pitch or the first paragraph, which is the hook, and then to do the analytics in the classroom, interactive, of like, is this a good one, is this a bad one? To really show the limitations of what was going on in artificial intelligence. So I think there are ways to use it, and we're going to see a lot more innovation on how AI can be an extension of the teacher on things that the teacher can then spend more optimal time in other spaces. Khan Academy has what Conmigo right now is a way to think about, are there ways that we could be helping teachers be more productive and have them focused on critical pieces of that. And I think artificial intelligence can help guide students on kind of the technical pieces, but how do you use kind of the capabilities of teachers? And my mom was a math teacher, and so I have a big passion around helping students actually find their path, because that's probably the hardest part for them.
Well, and it also teases out critical thinking, which is one of your other C's, right? Because I was just talking to a friend, and she was saying it's amazing how ChatGPT is brilliant at things I know nothing about and only half right on things that I actually know something about, right?
But that's a part of it, and what we're seeing more and more, particularly. So here are a couple stats as it relates to kind of what's going to happen in the workforce. Many small businesses are using AI. If you're a small business kind of between like 11 and 20, they're using AI all the time. And those small businesses are actually hiring additional people.
Oh.
If you're in a bigger business, what you're seeing folks do is have, in essence, hackathons with their employees to say, solve a problem. And then they're integrating the solutions into the workplace. And that does two different things. One, it creates a solution that optimizes folks in the workplace, but it exposes the employees to doing playing with artificial intelligence in a different way.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to be really important.
It's fascinating. I would love to shift to a general question that I've been grappling with over the past few weeks, which is, what is one of the biggest misconceptions you see about workforce development in Texas?
Oh my gosh, misconceptions. I mean, we know this when I first got to Houston, and it's not Texas alone, but we seem to think that the only pathway to economic success is a 4-year college degree. Mixed results. There are a ton of really great jobs that are not going to go away, that are going to be adjacent to artificial intelligence. I mentioned the mechanical trades and others. Those middle skill occupations are going to become just as critical in the economy that's coming, as opposed to having kind of the expertise of an artificial intelligence and AI engineering and other things. So part of it is, I think the misconception that is really, really important is there are a lot of places to go in the economy and be hugely successful, both in terms of those opportunities and other things. And I think the other misconception in the economy is just how strong Texas is as it relates to innovation. And we have innovation that is venture capital backed, and we have innovation that requires huge, deep research, whether it's cancer or whether it's our energy industry. And that innovation economy is an anchor of kind of the Texas economy, and I think that's part of the misconception. Oh, that's the energy economy, or it's Austin and technology. It's really the innovation that's critically important that makes the Texas economy so strong.
Well, and more long-lasting, I'd
Yeah.
imagine, too, more agile and ability to adapt. As you know, Texas in-migrates a lot of talent. We steal talent from other states around us. Do you see that trend continuing? Do you see Texas, as we have scaled more affordable paths to degrees, credentials of value, as we've scaled dual credit in our K-12, do you see that setting us on a path to have more stronger, skilled local talent that may help our employers rely less on migrating talent in from elsewhere?
I think so. I mean, we can use some bright spots, here in, Texas. San Antonio is doing a really good job in terms of how it's building the workforce that's needed for the San Antonio economy. El Paso's doing the same thing. Houston's doing it. Austin's doing it. Dallas is doing it. And I want to kind of highlight a very specific thing that's going on in North Texas with the University of North Texas that's trying to create something called the Texas Talent Accelerator. And it's this idea of how do you get that collective table of employers and the growth of the industries, the education providers, and the economic development and business community in a very different way to say, what's the need coming and how are we going to meet that need? And if we can't, we need to find different ways to do it, which then requires, and this is probably hard for a lot of educational institutions, how do we actually work together to meet that need? Because if University of North Texas and Texas Women's, deliver 2,000 nurses that may be needed annually there, but the healthcare folks need 4,000, we need to have a different conversation about how do we meet that need. And so I think it's going to be that kind of collaboration, and Texas is known for that. And so I think we just need to continue to reinforce bringing those collective tables together.
I think that's brilliant, and it also taps on some of the skills that may be underrated or underestimated. And I would love, as you look at our talent pipeline, you've talked a lot about skills that you wish someone would have. I think we've heard employers talk about competency-based learners and the desire to have folks who can sit at a table with a team and make eye contact and problem solve. What is the most underrated skill in your conversations at the foundation for students or employees to have?
I think it's going to be this learning piece, but I also think the other opportunity we need to be thinking about, and I'll play with some numbers, from Houston, which is, Houston has 3.4, 3.5 million folks in the workforce, and 40% of them are ALICE, which means they're in low, maybe mid-wage occupations and they're stuck. We need to find ways to help them progress, and which then means we need to pay attention to adult basic education. And I think the opportunity diploma that's built in House Bill 8 is an opportunity to do that. But we need to be thinking about how are we actually helping a big chunk of that workforce upskill into these new roles, which requires different kinds of investment and different ways to do it. And that's one of the other areas that I'm working on at the Chamber Foundation is, I assume you have a flexible spending account?
Yes.
Or an HSA?
Yes.
And most people online probably do. Imagine if we had something similar, but you could buy the next skills education. So there are 170 million people in the US workforce today. And once again, it's a pretty balanced 30% in high skilled, about 50% in some variation of mid skill, and about 20% in low skilled. We're going to need to be upskilling and reskilling at scale in a very different way than we've ever had to before, based on how we open, which is the economy's changing so quickly. So how are we going to do that and ensure folks find those pathways? And we're going to need artificial intelligence to help career coach them and help them find the paths into a community college program or another skills program that actually gets them to the next kind of destination job.
And is that a public-private partnership endeavor? What is the role in kind of big P state policy versus something that employers are really grappling with within their own workforce?
I mean, our perspective at the Chamber Foundation, which is probably a lot of what takes place here, is that it needs to be an employee and an employer investment. And I won't get into the wonky pieces of it, but our goal is to have Section 127 of the Internal Revenue Code, which is where education benefits are housed right now, to add a provision that would allow for the creation of a skills savings account. Right now, an employer has to adopt an education assistance plan. Many people have heard about tuition reimbursement. That allows up to $5,250 to be tax-free to the employee for anything the employer provides that. But a lot of small and mid-sized employers, which a big chunk of the workforce, don't have the ability to do it. This would be a turnkey solution.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, the final question I have for you, we have very curious people who tune into this. So I'm wondering if you have a book, podcast, or article that you might recommend folks follow on workforce. So what has you thinking in recent weeks?
I was all over the map recently. I mean, Lightcast has an interesting thing, which really is around the demographic shifts that are occurring that we need to pay attention to in the country. And it's kind of rude awakening in terms of what we're going to need to do. I mean, most of the education folks here know there's a cliff coming soon. But how are we as a state, how are we as a country going to address that? And then the other piece really is around, how are we thinking differently about what are we going to need to do about artificial intelligence? I'm spending a lot of time just thinking about that to try to answer the question, and all I get is like, we're going to have to be agile in a very different way than we've ever been.
Especially when you think about, we are at the least developed artificial intelligence moment than we will be for the next forever.
But it's going to continually change, which is why it's like, so what?
Where do you spend your time? Well, Peter, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to those who tuned in to our Lone Star P3 live event. We will be back in a few months with another engaging conversation with policy and practitioner leaders across Texas. Thank you so much.